Our first presenter and her co-authors is Robin Navi. She's a professor of communication in our lovely department. Her research focuses on the role of motion in media processes and effects, and she's widely known for that. She has particular emphasis on the persuasive effect of emotion-based messages and the use of media for coping with stress. She's a recent fellow of the ICA, and their title is Coping with COVID-19, the Role of Media in Reducing Stress and Enhancing Well-Being in Early Stages of the COVID-19 Pandemic. Robin, take it away. Claps enthusiastically, Deborah. So Robin, are you here?
Yeah, just 1 second. I need to promote her to panelist.
Again? Okay, sorry.
Yeah, no worries.
No, it's not your fault.
Sorry to our panelists.
Yeah.
Okay, so Robin's there and Musa also, I promoted him to panelist for later.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me. Oh, okay, it's like half my head there. Okay, so I'm here.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Gavin, because I was getting a little worried that somehow I was not going to be able to get in. So thank you for that. And am I able to share my screen now? Looks like I can. Okay, so Ron, does my time start now?
It does.
Okay, I actually have a timer. So that way I stay on track. All right, so thank you, Ron, for that introduction, and thank you to all of you out there who, I can't see many of you, but thank you for tuning in. I'm going to just jump right into it. I don't think it's a surprise that there is a stress epidemic in America. I don't think that's news to any of you. I'm going to show you some slightly older data. The American Psychological Association does a Stress in America survey, sort of year after year. And in 2015, they demonstrated that there's a lot of stress in America, particularly among millennials and Gen Xers, less so for boomers and mature Americans, but there's significant amounts of stress. And importantly, more people year over year across generations were indicating that they're feeling more stress in the current year than the year before. And I just want to highlight that this is before the 2016 election and all the events that have unfolded in the years since, and particularly in this past year with COVID and other events. In their most recent Stress in America survey, they looked at parents versus non-parents and found that, again, lots of stress, but particularly among parents. Nearly half reported an 8, 9, or 10 on this 1 to 10 stress scale. So there's a lot of stress, and all of us are familiar with this. This isn't news. What is the consequence of stress? Why do we care? Well, stress is uncomfortable. Of course, we know that. We feel psychologically uncomfortable, but there are ramifications of stress that are really critical. The more stressed we are, the more susceptible we are to physical illness, both infections as well as the development of chronic illness. We experience reduced productivity at work and in school. There's relational strain, so we may be more likely to have conflict with our relational partners and within our families, and it overall reduces our quality of life. So stress, not a good thing, right? So this leads us to the question of how do we regulate stress? And the coping literature says, well, there's kind of 2 things that we need to do. One is we need to deal with the emotions around the stressor, right? So how do we reduce the negative emotions? In this case, with COVID, we may be feeling a lot of anxiety, uncertainty about what's going to happen this summer. What about employment options, financial, whatever the source of the negative emotions might be, we need to find a way to regulate those. So that's one. And the other is what we call problem-focused coping, which is how do we practically address what the stressor is, right? So it could be in terms of COVID, well, how do we protect ourselves from getting sick with social distancing or being vaccinated or wearing a mask? So as we think about how do we engage in both forms of coping, I'm sure that you've heard this type of advice, right? How do you manage your stress? Well, we're told things like eat healthy, right? Make sure you have your fruits and vegetables, right? Your 5 servings a day. You want to calm your body, right? So meditate, take your deep breaths, right? Maybe do some yoga, get enough sleep. You want to exercise, drink enough water, all that. And then we also see this, and it's typically a big slash through media. We turn off the screens, right? Don't watch the news. It's just going to upset you. Put your phone down, get out into nature. So what we hear about media tends to be avoid it. It's only going to cause problems for you. As a media effects scholar, I go, you know what? Media is a tool, right? And so it's not inherently negative. So let's think about like what role media really serves. And I do want to highlight that both the National Institutes of Mental Health as well as the Centers for Disease Control have almost the exact same advice, right, about how to cope with COVID. And what we see are take care of your body. We want to have social support, get the right information. You want to unwind and relax. And again, take breaks from news. So we don't hear anything positive about media. We're just told pretty much avoid it. However, the media effects research shows that people use media. And I think Ron was sort of making this point a moment ago, that there's a lot of benefits that we can get from our media exposure. So we can connect with other people. Socially, we can connect. We can learn information from whether it's social media or from the news. We can try to de-stress by playing video games. We can lose ourselves in a book or in a good movie or TV show. And there's enough research out there that suggests that people typically will turn to media to regulate their moods. When COVID first hit, so in the sort of March, April of a year ago, some research looking at how much media were people consuming? And across generations, the evidence shows that there is quite a large increase in people's media use and exposure. It was a little bit different across generations. So boomers saw the greatest increase in their broadcast TV use. Gen Xers saw an increase in broadcast TV as well as online streaming, online videos. Millennials, less so with broadcast, more with the online streaming content. But the general message here is people were turning to media, or at least using it to a much greater extent than they had been prior to the COVID crisis. Now, it could be we're just all home and we have nothing else to do, and so we're just turning on media. But another possibility is maybe this is actually serving a valuable function for us. So the key research question that we're addressing here is how does media, and not just how does media use, but how does media use compared to other recommended coping strategies influence emotion-focused coping and problem-focused coping? So that was our goal. Now, this was probably the fastest I've ever done any kind of research in my life, where it's like COVID hit and we like got human subject approval and jumped in with this survey about a week later. So Laura, Nathan, and Lee and I have been working on this for the past year, but we conducted a survey with the help of Qualtrics and some funding from UCSB of 564 US adults. This was matched to the US Census. And we were interested in how people were using media and other strategies to cope with stress. And we collected the data in that very beginning of the stay-at-home order. So just to give you a sense, this is how much people were moving around based on their cell phone data at the beginning of March. The bluer and greener it gets, the more people are staying put. Right, so this is the first week of March, the second week. Now we get the third week, we start collecting our data here, and this is the last week. So people are pretty much staying home. So we got them right at the beginning of this is really new and what is going on. Okay. One of the questions we asked is a pretty extensive survey, but we asked an open-ended question. How are you coping with stress? And we coded the first response that people gave us with the assumption that that's their go-to strategy, the sort of top of mind. Now, not everyone was stressed. Some people believed it was a hoax. Some people still believe it was a hoax, and they weren't stressed at all or worried. But 435 of our respondents mentioned some response that was codable. And we had 28 different categories, but we've divided them out here by media strategies. And then we have the more traditional ones that we've broken out into emotion-focused and problem-focused. What we see here is that overall, media strategies represented 37% of the sort of how I'm coping responses. The most common response was TV, movies, and videos, like online videos, followed by reading, and then it goes down with music and video games, etc. About 33%, their first response was something that we would call emotion focused. So the calming behaviors of meditating or doing yoga or breathing. Some people said things like lighting candles or taking a bubble bath, but they're all designed to calm you down. The next highest was praying, that came up frequently, talking with others, which we're assuming was to kind of connect and get some emotional comfort, some creative outlets like hobbies to try to feel better, and cognitive reframing, or things like trying to think positively or looking for silver linings. About 17% of responses were problem focused. I'm social distancing, I'm washing my hands, I'm sanitizing the mail, and anything else that might come into my, my domain. And then finally, we didn't know quite where to put this. So we have it separate, but they're physical things like I'm doing aerobic exercising and I'm sleeping. And it's not clearly emotion focused. Maybe it is, but we chose to keep that separate. But the takeaway here is that people are turning to media a lot, and they're turning to media as often as these other categories, if not more so. But the next question is, okay, so they're doing this, but how does that relate to stress, and how does it relate to coping? So we had a number of closed-ended measures, and we were looking to see how does their stress level relate to their coping strategy use frequency, and how does that relate to their emotion and problem-focused coping. So our key variables here were stress related to COVID-19. We asked about their frequency of using media to cope, and it was specifically media to cope. We had different measures for how frequently do you typically watch television and go online and that sort of thing. So we controlled on their general frequency, and here we're asking, are you using it to cope? We have the other coping strategies in there as well, as you can see there on the slide. And then our sort of outcomes of interest were coping efficacy, our indicator of emotion-focused coping. And coping efficacy is that I feel like I'm doing this well, like I'm handling this pretty well, right? So emotionally, they're doing well. And the problem-focused coping was represented by social distancing. You might recall a year ago, we were told don't wear masks. So we didn't measure mask wearing. There are no vaccines, couldn't do that, but social distancing was the big recommendation at the time. So all the analyses that I'm going to show you from here out in control on demographics, they control on frequency of media use, political ideology, we threw everything in there that we could. I also want to note, I understand as cross-sectional data that we're not making causal claims. So I'll try to be careful as I express this, but what we're laying out in these models is conceptually, theoretically, what we would expect. Okay, so our first hypotheses were that, hey, people who are stressed are not going to feel like they're coping particularly well, but people who feel like they're coping well may be better situated to engage in problem-focused coping. And we see support for that those who are more stressed felt like I'm not coping very well, and people who are coping well were also social distancing. So this is as we expected. And now the question is, where do these coping strategies fit within this model? So the first thing we did was look at the relationship between stress and all the different coping strategies that we measured. I'm breaking this out into media and non-media, because otherwise everything would be super small. But what we found was that the more stressed people were, the more they engaged with media to cope. Every different type of media we asked about was significantly related to their stress level. The betas, the associations were between about 0.1 and 0.35, with the highest being internet browsing, TV watching, and news programming. But they're all positive and all significant. Stress also related to a range of non-media strategies, and you can see them here: napping, meditating, praying, and eating healthy and unhealthy, as it turns out. Exercise and thinking positively, there's just no relationship there. And these relationships were in the 0.1 to 0.2 range, so a little bit smaller than the strongest media relationships. Okay. So where do these fit in terms of coping? This model, again, we sort of put this all together. Anything that wasn't significant, we removed. And what we see is that three media variables, the monitoring the news, watching TV, listening to music, those emerged along with both eating and healthy and unhealthy food. Now, the three that related to coping efficacy, watching television, listening to music, eating healthy and unhealthy foods, interesting, but I think particularly interesting is that we had a significant indirect effect of stress on coping efficacy through watching television and movies. In other words, the more stressed people were, the more they were watching TV and movies to cope, the more they were doing that, they were also reporting that they were coping better. In terms of problem-focused coping, we see that the news was the only variable that positively related. Those who were not eating and drinking healthy were also not social distancing. So that's not good coping. We're going to put that aside. Right? But looking at the news, those who are more stressed were watching the news more. Those who are watching the news more were also social distancing more. And again, that indirect effect was significant. We also saw serial mediation that was significant. If they were more stressed, they're watching more TV, they were more coping more effectively, and social distancing more. So there's something going on here with television. Again, totally recognize, huge caveat, no claims of causality, but it does fit sort of our theoretical model that media, TV use and movies, TV and movies in particular, can be a coping resource, both in terms of potentially building coping efficacy, as well as perhaps indirectly aiding problem-focused coping. And this is important because television and movies, this sort of entertainment media, is a really valuable tool. There's a vast range of resources that are available. They're cheap, right? We can access them whenever we want for as long as we want. We don't need any skill. I don't know about you. I'm not good at meditating, right? But I can turn on the TV and I can binge watch for a couple of hours, and that helps me feel better. And it also gives us a sense of this is normal. So when things are uncertain, whether it's COVID or some other crisis that you might be experiencing for whatever reason, watching that show gives you a sense that this is, this is what I usually do. The world isn't completely turned upside down. So in terms of the novel contribution to media research, we have not seen a study that compares whether media, first of all, we haven't seen whether media relates to chronic stressors and significant stressors in a positive way. But we also haven't seen research that looks at how people use media and its benefits relative to other coping strategies. And what we see here is people do a lot of stuff, but it seems to be in this context that the media use may have provided the most benefit. So in terms of future research, a couple questions to ask are, do these patterns of media use predict well-being over time? Right? We've got the cross-sectional data, what's happening over time. We do have some panel data from last April and May, where we asked about a whole host of well-being measures at time one. And then we looked at those same well-being measures a month later and looking to see what the role of media was. And of course, no time to talk about it now, as I look at Ron, who's smirking at me like, yes, you don't have time. But in essence, there was some evidence of a spiral that those who were higher in well-being at time one, they were choosing things that were more uplifting and inspiring. And they had higher well-being a few weeks later, controlling on their initial well-being. We see the opposite for people who were stressed and choosing the news. So there's some evidence that people are making choices that might reinforce the state that they're already predisposed to. So this leads to the question, well, if what you naturally do could hurt you, is there a way we could turn this around? So we have some research on whether we can harness media to promote well-being, and we're calling this media prescriptions. And we also have data from November, both with UCSB undergrads, as well as with the US adult sample, that people who are sort of prescribed to watch more positive media, whether it's humorous or whether it's inspiring and uplifting, report less stress, higher coping efficacy, greater goal achievement, higher life satisfaction in the weeks that follow. So I will stop there and yield whatever time I have left to the presenters and to the Q&A. So thank you.
Fascinating, Robin. As always, you and your research are always so energetic and interesting. I identified with the napping. I have radically changed my behavior. I'll soon probably join the owls. And I know a lot of people have commented on how they changed their eating habits. But I do agree with, I mean, in general, the notion that we can turn to media for many positive aspects. And I had a very early conversation with Amy Gonzalez, who, for the rest of you, she's on our faculty as well. And she and I both agreed that we stopped reading, we stopped looking or exposing ourselves to negative stuff, stories, movies. There were whole classes of movies I won't watch anymore. My wife and I watch a lot of movies, but I'm very happy with watching animation or science fiction. It's just, we're all just shell-shocked. Really. So I think you're absolutely right.
Some people were watching pandemic movies. That was one of our questions was, are you watching movies and playing video games about pandemics? People are like, yep. You know, so people see
sadomasochism,
you know, in what they consume, and that some people feel better watching other horrors.
That's true. That's true. Well, it's like watching an accident, right? Thank God it's not me. Mm-hmm. Fascinating. Really, really cool stuff. And again, it is amazing how researchers can respond so quickly and do really good research. I mean, it's not sloppy, it's not fast, it's not slapdash. So people have a lot of expertise that they can bring to bear at a very short time period. It's just, it's impressive. And you know, there's a ton of research that has already come out and published. So lots of other people have done the same thing too.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to present. Let me share my screen here. So I'm not the first author on this. Ryan Fuller is. He's at the California State University of Sacramento. He is a former graduate student of our program. I was actually his advisor. So I just want all those graduate students who are watching to know, A, yes, you can finish. B, if you want to, you can end up to be a faculty member. And C, we will track you down. You can't escape. Also, Andrew Pye, who's at Clemson University, he helped with some of our work. So the question here is, how do NPOs respond to this crisis, particularly from a communication perspective? So I'm not going to go into a lot of details of the text, but basically this is grounded in crisis management research. And you can define, you know, what a crisis is. There's a threat, there's uncertainty, but it's also true that there's possibilities for growth and learning, as has been pointed out in several of the presentations already. There are different kinds of crises, operational crises or paracrises. I'm mentioning these things because there's a literature on all of them. We build them into our model. Of course, central to crisis management communication is the use of external channels. We also measured internal channels, but we're not talking about that here. And there's lots of benefits. A public presence, you should just be in the stakeholder in the public's eye. You can also frame interpretations. You can also engage stakeholders, which is particularly important for NPOs, but also, you know, commercial companies that need consumers. And a lot of recent research on social media. And one of the studies has classified purposes for nonprofit organizations into information or broadcast, taking action, or dialogic and community. And that was mentioned earlier as well, that a lot of the social media is often used just for this purpose here. We'll come back to that. Well, there's a huge literature on preparing for crises. And here's all sorts of things that people can do. And of course, we measure all of them. There's an experiential aspect of crisis management, which is what experiences do you have from past crises? And also, what kind of concerns do you have about future crises? So that kind of shapes your perception of what to look for and how well you think you need to prepare. And I'm going to mention something interesting about this in a moment. Another thing that's new, and Ryan and his co-authors have developed a very, very good measure, validated measure across multiple countries on what's called preparing for renewal. This links back to the notion that just because you have a crisis doesn't mean that it can't be a learning and positive growth experience. So that's characterized in terms of using ethical communication, honest, open, but also effective organizational rhetoric. And we have a very good scale for that. certainly, along with the work that Tammy and others done, how do you assess the extent of a crisis? Well, there's multiple ways of doing it. We used a particular measure that indicated the level of uncertainty, the level of urgency, and the level of severity. So for instance, you could have very high severity with very low uncertainty. You know that if you don't get down in your tornado basement, bad things are going to happen. In urgency, sometimes you have a lot more time to prepare. So it's interesting to see how people assessed COVID-19. Now, this is, I think, our key contribution, which is, given that renewal perspective, you also want to look at how these organizations respond to COVID-19. And there's a series of ways. Well, you could just exit. You could shut down, either because you're forced to, or you just feel you shouldn't go on. You can retrench, which is, oh, I need to cut back on my expenses. So the universities, UCSB and others, have had to do some retrenchment. Maintaining core activities, which is, we're going to focus on our core, and we're going to persevere. We're going to go through this. We're going to survive. We're going to be resilient. And again, Tammy's work talks to that a lot. But also, you can imagine pivoting, which is, we're going to use this to innovate. And Dr. Del Reynoso pointed out that the COVID-19 crisis has allowed and forced Santa Barbara Department of Public Health to rethink how they provide health services. So that's an innovating response, even though they might also do some of these other things. So there's a really interesting literature on nonprofit organizations. I didn't know so much about this until I got into this field, but I do a lot of public communication campaign research. So there's some overlap here. In any event, they're defined specifically and legally, and they actually have to have a certain kind of certification, and they have to follow certain regulations, but they're very important contributors to local economies, national economies, and also to democracy, because it allows people to engage in activities that help others. They depend very heavily on public financial support. Conferences and fundraising events are two of their major ways of generating revenue, in addition to straightforward donations. And of course, those shut down during this time. There's a huge amount of money involved in these donations. And because these are legal entities and they want to qualify as certain kinds of NPOs, they have to fill out an IRS Form 990 and provide lots of information about the organization. Why do I mention that? Because we were able to get that, and so we can build that into our model. With respect to NPOs, how do they respond to to crises? Well, they are going to use their channels. They're going to try and understand their stakeholders. They're going to try and be proactive. They're going to use social media. And they need to respond to a wide range of these. So they need to prepare ahead of time. And finally, what kind of impacts? Well, there were a number of early studies estimating what the impacts would be, and now there's some coming out on NPOs. So revenue and donation loss. Reduced volunteers or staff. These are people who can't come, or because of freezes or furloughs or cuts or layoffs, they don't have them anymore. They have all sorts of other costs associated with health and sanitation and redesign of access. And they also need to communicate more with underserved populations, because those are the people specifically who need their help during these times. So here's our model. And it is, in fact, an overtime model and a causal model, because we have T1 data and T2 data. So communication, crisis experience concerns, crisis preparation and management, organizational resources. COVID happens. Then you engage in time to media, and then also you assess the extent and the impacts of COVID, and how do all these things affect your responses, these three kinds of responses. So we had a lot of information on the organizations from the IRS form. We had a survey in March to September of 2019. It just so happens we were doing the study anyway before COVID. We did not know that COVID-19 was coming. And interesting, I mentioned on that survey, we asked about expected possible crises. 0% mentioned that something like a pandemic might be a future crisis. 0%. It's very sad that that didn't continue to be zero. Then about a year later, we followed up because we had these data on the companies. We knew who the contact was in their email, so we followed up with them. So we have a panel data of about 578 organizations. And then we also collected tweets and followers and followed during 2 months in both years. So we have a lot of data, a lot of interesting data. Interestingly, they sort of felt, and this is time two now, this is about a year after, about 9 months after the crisis, they didn't feel it was really extreme. It's on a 4.72 and a 1.7 scale. So this is above neutral, but it's not excessive. What kind of impacts? Well, again, we listed 11 kinds of impacts, and on average, they mentioned 4.5 of them. Mostly loss of revenue, decrease in number of volunteers, and some, in fact, most, over half have stopped some operations, but only 9% actually exited. And then they had to switch to offering hybrid kinds of services. So that's kind of just in general for the profession itself. What did they do? How did they respond? Well, the least frequent was retrenchment. Remember, Npos are pretty resilient organizations, and they're there to support society. So they're not going to bail out of the marketplace all that quickly. The most frequent was perseverance. This is of the 5 kinds of perseverance. They, on average, mentioned 2.75 of them, selected 2.75. And innovating was also, over half of the items that they pointed out. So this is interesting too. Not all NPOs respond the same way. And retrenchment is not, in the first 9 months, that was not the major response that they had. Okay, so what are our results? I'll try and be simple here. You can see here's the retrenchment, here's persevering, and here's innovating, and here's the variables that were significant influences. And I'll talk about those in a little bit. But I just want to point out a few things. For retrenchment, almost none of the preparation stuff mattered. It's as though they're operating in a bit of a vacuum, and when they get pressure from the environment, they just cut back, so they're not proactively engaged with their environment. That's one way of interpreting it. And of course, if they feel that the crisis is high in extent and there are a lot of impacts, they're going to retrench. If they have a lot of employees, they're going to retrench. If they have higher liabilities to assets ratio, they're going to retrench. And if they have lower program to expenses ratio, they're going to retrench. What this says is, if you're kind of just doing your ordinary work, but you're pretty leveraged in terms of your resources and the impacts, you're going to probably retrench. So this can be used as an evaluation perspective. And again, retrenchment is not necessarily a bad decision, right? It can be entirely reasonable, but it's not much influenced by what the organization does ahead of time. Now, persevering is interesting because here, if I communicate with my external population, and particularly if I use social media for community involvement, and if I did a lot of tweets, or more tweets anyway, I didn't have a lot of prior experience with paracrises, but I was concerned about them. And then the same thing, extent and impacts. And here, none of the organizational financial resources mattered. So this is almost the complete opposite. This is shared, but these are different. And the argument here is that organizations that persevere interact with their communities, and they're concerned about things that will happen in the future, but concerned about things, so paracrises are things that happen sort of from the outside, like legislation or bad press. And it turns out that the resources and how well you're actually doing from the financial point of view are really kind of irrelevant, which is intriguing. We still explain the same amount of variance. Now, innovating, remember that was the middle level, somewhat similar to persevering, but a few additional things. So for instance, they're concerned about operational crises, so how things work internally. Here, they are in fact at time 1 more ready for renewal in case the crisis happens. Here, the extent of the crisis is not as influential. The impacts are because you're feeling them. And here, the liabilities to assets ratio. This is actually good. If you have, well, no, it's not good. If you have more liabilities to your assets, then that means you're in sort of a less resource rich environment. So there's a clear distinction between these two and this, but also there's some subtle distinctions with innovating. And if you want to talk about more than just persevering, but actually innovating, moving forward into the environment, you can see that there's at least one influence from all of these categories. So a lot of things are affecting that. So I'm not going to go through, this is just summarizes what I just said. This is for retrenchment. This is for Perseverance. I just loved it. They just happened to have one of these. They just happened to go to land on Mars before I did this this PowerPoint. And then you can see with the innovating, there's a lot of different factors that go. So innovating is really a very intriguing possible response, and it's quite complex. There's a lot of things going on that affect that. So it's going to be much more difficult to manage. So what are some practical implications of this? First of all, I think early on, discussing how you might respond to crises, even ones that you think might not happen. So again, no one thought a pandemic was going to happen. I mean, who would have? Who would have thought that would have been crazy? But there's all sorts of tools to use: scenario planning, talk-throughs, practice responses. Some organizations don't feel they have the time to do that, or the resources, or the knowledge. Evaluate your own risk profile. We mentioned this before with He-Jing's presentation, is that COVID-19 is experienced by everybody. So this is common to all these nonprofit organizations. So it's not like it's idiosyncratic. So what is your risk profile for things that are common as well as unique? So what kind of strengths does your communities have? And what kind of vulnerabilities do they have? And then we can see that communication wasn't actually all that relevant for retrenchment. And we saw, in fact, some barriers. Some places didn't actually have good budgets or any budgets, and they didn't have enough training. So they had to switch really quickly. As Dr. Reynoso pointed out, all of a sudden they had to hire a media specialist because all of a sudden they had to do a lot of social media and online web design. Another interesting point from a media perspective is the research shows very clearly that most organizations and most NPOs use social media for information sharing, that is broadcasting, one way. That's a big critique in the public relations literature. Just one way, it's not dialogic. However, what we found was that if the organization used social media for building community, not just information and not just action, they were more likely to persevere and also innovate. So they're engaged with their community. That takes a different mindset. And as Dr. Reynoso pointed out, and also John Longbreak, they had to hire staff and they work nonstop. It's not an easy thing to do. It takes a big commitment. So here's a somewhat hopeful, is that if you're sort of prepared for it and you have the right vision, you can respond to these crises like COVID-19 in a natural defensive way, which is perfectly reasonable, but also you can find ways to innovate and move forward. So the readiness for renewal early on has actually a slightly positive effect. So you could change your management, your training, even your culture and your vision of your NPO to emphasize this. So I'll just point out that this study, like the other studies, made some contributions. Again, we had before and after. We had a very large set of NPOs. We had a wide range of data. We looked at some different ways of thinking about crisis management, emphasizing renewal. And we looked at some different ways of talking about responses from exit all the way up through innovating, and then the role of communication and media within all that. Very quickly, for those of you interested, there's a lot of local resources for disaster relief. You can see all these places here. You can get involved or contribute. There's also training available for faculty, staff, and students. Students who want to get into, nonprofit communication. Get to training here and learn how to communicate and deal with risk communication, or actually get trained in public affairs treatment and responses to disasters. So thank you. I'll end there and I'll stop sharing. I've shared enough. Great. Okay, our last presenter is Musa Malik is presenting for the Media Neuroscience Lab group. Does regional variation in pathogen prevalence predict the use of moralizing language in COVID-19 news? And of course, this completely corresponds with our prior presentation. And he's a graduate student in the Department of Communication, and he's also a researcher in the Media Neuroscience Lab. He's passionate about the development of algorithmic tools that facilitate research in computational communication science. So Musa, please take it away.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm excited. Share my screen. Okay, can everybody see? Presentation slide. All good.
Awesome.
Brilliant. Awesome. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Musa Malik. I'm a graduate student, as Professor Weiss nicely pointed out, at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and I'm also a researcher at the Media Neuroscience Lab. And today, I'll be talking about some of our work that explores whether or not regional variation in pathogen prevalence can predict the moralization of language in COVID-19 news. I hope you guys enjoy the presentation. So, a little background. Over the course of our evolutionary history, infectious diseases have remained a fundamental selection pressure on all of us. And in response, we've been able to develop something we call the physiological immune system, which has been helping us safeguard against invading parasites. But recent work also suggests that in addition to the physiological immune system, we also have a complementary behavioral immune system that is designed specifically to reduce the probability of infection in the first place. Now, the behavioral immune system is really powerful in the sense that it allows you to monitor a variety of salient, non-pathogenic cues in your environment so that you can proxy the likelihood of whether there is an infectious agent present there or not. But it's this very sensitivity to non-pathogenic cues that can elicit even aversive behavioral responses, prejudiced attitudes, even if the actual real probability of infection is low. So taking this idea of the behavioral immune system, Thornhill and Fincher in 2014 suggested a parasite stress model that basically suggests that the spatial-temporal variation in parasite adversity across different cultures, across different times, has the capacity to influence human culture and can give rise to communal value systems that help shape and guide an individual's behavior in their respective society. So from this ultimate perspective, then we can start thinking that, okay, well, the uniqueness or the distinctiveness of certain socio-cultural practices, especially in regions where pathogen prevalence has been really high, that could simply be argued to be a response to the need of effectively avoiding disease. And what's really interesting and relevant to this presentation and our research is that increases in parasite stress and parasite adversity can actually increase group-focused moral concerns. How do we conceptualize and operationalize moral concerns? Well, we draw on a popular theoretical framework. Of course, there are a number of them in the literature, but this is the framework that we use for our study, the moral foundations theory. And what it suggests is that there are 5 innate, universal moral foundations that exist in all of us, and these help us shape and guide our cognitive and behavioral responses to different situations. What are these moral foundations? They include things like care harm. So each moral foundation is associated with a virtue dimension and a vice dimension. So in this example, care would be the virtue, meaning care foundation has been upheld, and harm would be the violation. So care foundation has been violated. So the care harm foundation basically refers to ideas of generosity, empathy, and kindness towards other people. We've got fairness and cheating that relates to ideas of reciprocity and equality in society. We've got loyalty and betrayal, which taps into our tribal tendencies of self-sacrifice for the group and patriotism. It includes authority and subversion, which signals the importance of hierarchical social interactions and respect for tradition. That includes sanctity degradation, which is related to our psychology of disgust and our sensitivity to contamination. And all of these foundations can broadly be grouped into 2 different categories. On the left-hand side, you've got the individualizing foundations, which, as the name suggests, relate to the protection of the rights and freedoms of an individual. And on the right-hand side, you've got the binding foundations, which are more related to the preservation of the group. And it's in particular the moral norms that emphasize the binding foundations that have been argued recently to have the capacity to reduce pathogen transmission because they have the ability to increase in-group cohesion within different community networks. So, you're encouraging people to be loyal to the group, and you're encouraging people to abide by the law, and you're encouraging people to maintain bodily and spiritually, purity rituals. So when you hear this, you go like, okay, well, maybe the moralization of disease-related language in global news might be able to encourage people to abide more with the binding foundations, and thereby reduce the likelihood of pathogen spread in different countries and different regions. And from here, we draw on the model of intuitive morality and exemplars, which suggests that moral arguments in particular, moral arguments being societal prescriptions for good and bad behavior in society, that these are instrumental language cues that can help yield optimal outcomes for society as a whole, including COVID-19 related health behaviors. But research in this area has remained pretty limited for three major reasons. One, well, we haven't had a pandemic recently, so COVID-19's advent, sadly, provides us an opportunity to research these topics as these questions become more and more relevant in real time. Historically, we've also had challenges accessing global pandemic news or news of any kind at scale, but advancements in computational communication research make access to information at scale pretty easy. And finally, the concept of morality, of course, is elusive itself in nature. So conceptualizing and operationalizing it is a challenging task in itself. But work recently that has advanced moral text mining allows us to also extract these latent moral cues in our data. So keeping all of this stuff in mind, we state the following hypothesis and ask the following research questions. Number one, we predict that HPP, historical pathogen prevalence, will be positively related to daily levels of media attention on COVID-19 news, which we dub MAC19 for this project. We ask a corresponding research question, which states or asks whether the reproduction rate of COVID-19, so the degree to which COVID-19 has spread within a region, does that moderate this relationship between HPP and MAC19? We state a second hypothesis that asks whether, or that states that HPP will positively predict the daily use of binding moral language, so moral language that adheres to the binding foundations that we just talked about, and a corresponding research question that asks whether or not pathogen spread of COVID-19 will moderate this relationship. And finally, given that we've been focusing a lot on the binding foundations, we also ask whether or not the reproduction rate of COVID-19 will moderate the relationship between HPP and the daily use of individual-oriented moral language. So how do we do this? Well, we selected 28 countries spanning the continental regions of the Americas, Asia Pacific, Middle East, and Europe. For each of these 28 countries, we retrieved news records using the Interface for Communication Research called ICOR. ICORs, think of it as a user-friendly gateway into accessing real-time mainstream global news with a click of a button. If you are more interested in it, please go to icor.mnl.ucsb.edu. Sorry for the plug. Using the news records, we sampled about 100 news headlines because that's the unit of our analysis for this research for the entire year of 2020. So 100 news headlines sampled randomly for 366 days for each of the 28 countries, yielding us about just over 1 million news headlines for our analysis. From these news headlines, we constructed two groups of variables for subsequent analysis. MAC19 is essentially a proportion of the articles or the headlines that are talking about COVID-19 or coronavirus in general. And for our moral variables, we used a popular text analytic tool called EMFD score. You can find more information about this tool at the bottom of the slide at the GitHub repository, which allows for fast, flexible extraction of the moral dimensions that we just talked about earlier on in the first slide. Now, thing to note over here, EMFD score is optimized for the English language, and we do study 28 different countries in multilingual formats. So in order to circumvent that challenge, we Google translated or machine translated all of our news headlines into the English language and then used EMFD score. So using the 10 outputs that EMFD score provides, which are all of the different dimensions of the moral foundations, We're not interested in those individual dimensions individually by themselves. So we constructed two indices. One of them was the binding index, which is essentially a summation of all of the dimensions that pertain to the binding foundations. So you've got your betrayals, your loyalties, your authorities, your subversions, your sanctities, and your degradations, all compiled into this one index. And we construct another index, which is the individualizing index. Of course, the summation of your cares, your fairnesses, your cheatings, and your harms, sorry. So this, from a morality variable construction perspective, this was sufficient for answering our research questions and testing our hypotheses. But later on in the project, we also conducted a number of additional post hoc analyses because we were interested in seeing the differential effects of moral virtues and moral vices when you are using the binding and the individualizing index. So using the same logic of summation, we constructed 4 different variables that looked at the virtue binding index and the vice binding index, and the same thing for the individualizing indices. And finally, we obtained our numerical estimates for the reproduction rate of COVID-19 using a popular online repository, ourworldindata.org, fantastic resource for future researchers or who want to use all of this. They've got tons of cool stuff over there. And for estimating our regional historical pathogen prevalence, we used the 2008 publication by Schaller and Murray for that data. Okay, results. So the first figure provides sort of a first visual inspection into the time series of media attention on COVID-19 or MAC-19. And as you can see, with the exception of Taiwan, Hong Kong, and China, which sort of peak a little bit earlier in the year, majority of the countries don't really pay that much attention to COVID-19 news in the early months of 2020. And MAC-19 really starts to pick up somewhere around mid-March, when I think the pandemic really hit its stride in the Western world. And that attention on COVID-19 news remains somewhat constant throughout the year, with of course substantial region-specific variation. And we do see a slight uptick near the end of the year of MAC-19, which might be a harbinger for the second wave that was to come and did come in 2021. Figure number 2 provides you with a visualization of MAC-19 and historical pathogen prevalence across different regions. Descriptively, we can see that overall, regions with a high HPP do tend to report more on COVID-19 news, but that's not always the case. I mean, and there are 2 notable exceptions I'd like to point out. You've got Canada, which historically has a very low HPP, but seemed to be paying a lot of attention to COVID-19 news during the year of 2020. And completely opposite to that is India, which has a high HPP, but surprisingly in the year of 2020, they did not pay too much attention on COVID-19 news, at least for the year of 2020, which is interesting, but also from a research perspective, I would be interested in seeing like what happens in 2021 when COVID-19 spread in particular has really changed the dynamics of how people conducted themselves and how media news reporting went on in India in recent months. So yeah, that's something for 2021, of course. Results. To test our hypotheses and answer our research questions, we constructed a number of multi-level linear growth models. We do find that, yes, there is a direct relationship between historical pathogen prevalence and media attention on COVID-19. So yes, we accept our first hypothesis, but we don't find any evidence for a moderating role of COVID-19 in this relationship between HPP and MAC-19. So therefore, we answer our research question 1 in the negative. We don't find a direct relationship between historical pathogen prevalence and the use of language that emphasizes the binding foundations, thereby rejecting our second hypothesis. But interestingly, we see that there is an interaction between COVID-19 reproduction rate and HPP to predict an increase in the use of language that represents the binding foundations, which essentially means that regions with a high HPP are more likely to use language with the binding foundations that represents the binding foundations when COVID-19 spread is particularly high there as well. So we answer our research question 2 in the affirmative. And finally, for research question 3, we don't find any direct relationship or any evidence of a moderating role of reproduction, a COVID-19 reproduction rate with HPP and individualizing index. And just be aware that this is the broad index that we created for the individualizing foundations and the binding foundations, and it does not look at the differential effects of virtues and vices, which we will now look at in the next slide. So for the virtue binding index, so binding index with, this is reflecting language that upholds the binding foundation. So you've got your loyalty, you've got your authority, and you've got your sanctity, not the violations. There is no relationship between HPP, direct relationship at least, or a moderating effect of COVID-19. We do see that the moderating role of COVID-19 actually comes into play. Significance is marginal, but there is a trend that regions with high HPP tend to report news that is high in language that is violating the binding foundations, especially when COVID-19 spread in that region is also high. We find a mitigation of the upholding of language that uses or emphasizes the individualizing foundations, and that has, the HPP has a direct mitigating effect on virtue individualizing index, and it also interacts with COVID-19 reproduction rate in order to predict the mitigation of this particular dimension of the individualizing foundations. And analogous to the vice binding index, we do see that the reproduction rate of COVID-19 interacts with HPP to predict an increase in the violations of the individualizing foundations, although the significance is again marginal, but we do think that there is some evidence of an interesting trend over here. So overall, in this study, we do demonstrate that yes, positive relationship between HPP and MAC19. There is no direct relationship between HPP and group-oriented language in COVID-19 news, but immediate pathogen stress, as proxied by the COVID-19 reproduction rate, that does interact with HPP to elicit language in news media that represents the binding moral foundations, and not just the overall binding moral foundations, but particularly there is interesting findings for its predictive effects for the increase in the violations of the binding and individualizing foundations, and also in the decrease in the upholding of the individualizing foundations. Future research will look into supplementing our analyses of news headlines with full text articles, because longer articles will provide us with more rich moral information, so we can see if our findings corroborate in that context as well. We would like to validate our automatically extracted moral foundation scores through crowdsourced manual content annotations. And we would like to complement our large-scale quantitative analysis with like a more qualitative, in-depth examination of surrounding topical context. So, at the moment, we're just looking at whether COVID-19 is mentioned or not, but I'm pretty sure like the discourse around mask wearing and COVID-19 and vaccinations and COVID-19 and imposition of lockdowns and all of that, that will definitely be different in its nature. That's about it from me. Thank you so much to all of, well, first of all, the audience for listening to me and humoring me and my research. But more especially, I would like to thank my collaborators, especially Frederick Hopp. Special shout out to you. You're a star. Congratulations on your recent acceptance to University of Amsterdam. You're going to do fantastic things in the future. So all my best wishes to you. Ibe Chen, analysis can't be possible without you. So thank you so much for being there throughout this project. And thank you, Renee Weber, for your mentorship and guidance throughout my time at Santa Barbara, not just UCSB. Thank you.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much. Yeah. We need like a huge like coliseum, like a football stadium versus people cheering, or maybe pipe it in like in the NBA games. All these are great, of course, except ours. But the last one shows the promise delivered of the ability to collect large scale data. We did a little bit with Twitter, but we didn't find a lot of that. But and not only the large scale data, but what it takes. I mean, for those of people who don't do it, I don't do it, but I've watched, the amount of detail and the amount of clerical work, the amount of programming, correcting programming, verification, and then filtering that through Renee is massive and hugely sophisticated. But look what they can do with it. They can see things that cannot be seen any other way. So I think this panel was very interesting in terms of just at the higher level, media. How are media used? How do they portray? How are they actually beneficial during these crisis times? Very interesting topic. Again, could have a whole conference on it. So I'm going to turn it over to Gavin to see whether we have some comments or questions to follow up on.
Yeah. The first question that we have is for Robin. It's from one of your former RAs, actually, who worked with you on a media prescriptions project. And the student is Laurent. And Laurent is curious if you think social media intervention could work in the same way as other types of media as a means to mitigate stress.
That's a good question. That's something that we were looking at in the project with Lauren. And I saw there's a question. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to answer it in there, just about the project that we had worked on in the fall with the undergraduates here, where we had an intervention where some got videos of different emotional qualities and another group was told just use social media for 5 minutes, just whatever it is you typically do. Lauren, to answer your question about have I looked at the data yet? It was just integrated recently and I couldn't resist. I was like, let me just look at a little something before this talk. So nothing's sort of official yet, but there's something that looks like social media was related to less procrastination, which seems very strange. So there's something going on with social media, but I don't know what it is yet. I would imagine that there'd be a way to harness it, but we don't know enough yet about what that would look like. So I'm going to pause there.
The suspense is enticing.
I know, leave us on a cliffhanger, why don't you? Yeah. Ron, I had a question about the research that you presented. Especially I'm curious in this idea that I've also heard much from the public relations and crisis communication literature that broadcasting one way is not really the best way to facilitate like a type of participation. And so I'm wondering, I can think of a few different factors that might be at play for organizations to actually build community in a crisis. Some things I think about are sense giving. Are they imparting a purpose or a mission to their stakeholders in a way that allows them to engage? I'm also thinking about agency. Do they give something for their stakeholders to do? But what are some of the things that you or your colleagues are thinking about when you think about building community within this crisis situation?
Oh, really interesting question. And that really speaks to very large literature, not just in public relations, but also organization communication, corporate social responsibility, or for that matter, government and citizenship, which is what's your underlying model for the role of information? And so often it's a question of facts and awareness. And those are extremely important. I mean, just think about all the misinformation we have here. But what we've seen with COVID-19 and masks, but what we've seen in even some of these presentations is it's not irrelevant, but it's often subjugated or interpreted in ways that don't really reflect the underlying knowledge, either misportraying the underlying knowledge or saying, yeah, well, that may be true, but that's not important to me. And so one of the flaws with that particular information model, it presumes that people don't have enough knowledge. And if I just give them knowledge, then of course they're going to change their attitude and they'll change their behavior and they'll be good people. And when you study a lot of this, you realize that none of that is true. So that's been a big issue in the environmental communication literature as well, is like repudiating the knowledge deficit model. And so Abel Gustafsson, who graduated here 2 years ago, he really focused on uncertainty processing and also the tribal communication that Daniel Kahan has worked on, which fits in with the moral value stuff very, very well. So the notion there is you need to have more interactive, more tailored communication. And one of the benefits of social media is it can do that in ways that traditional media could not, right? You could send out a news press or a magazine, or maybe a direct mail, or maybe a radio message, but no one could follow it up. They couldn't ask questions. You couldn't develop any engagement. So it's just facts. And so Robin's work shows very clearly that emotional responses are crucial. So how do you do that? Well, you develop these personal relationships. And so social media allows you to do that. Now, the interesting thing, which I think Claude pointed out, is of course, it can also do the exact opposite, right? The social media can be used to then focus on a very specific view about things that's impervious to knowledge. So also in this literature, there's an awful lot of warnings about social media. I mean, you're an organization, you take a stand, your stuff is going to get hacked, and there's going to be some really cool memes that you can't control. So no longer can you control. And in fact, there's some interesting research, one of you may know the title of the name of this, I can't remember, but where people take over social media sites that are set up by organizations to actually then use that to criticize the site. And some of your work on Uber looks at that same thing. Anyway, I'm kind of digressing, but you cannot not digress when you talk about social media. They're extremely complex and subtle and simultaneously contradictory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm especially contradictory thinking too about the data that Robin's sorting through of social media use might actually mean that I'm not procrastinating. So yeah,
That's
those
bizarre.
are.
I'm sorry, that's just bizarre.
Yeah, but really great thoughts, really great connections, and some
Actually,
things
let me
that
follow up in just a minute.
Yeah.
You know, in the organizational literature, I mean, that's a joke, that's bizarre, but it's not. In the organizational literature, there's a ton of work on how social media, quick interaction can help you filter through a lot of stuff. A lot of people will do that before they come to work. So they clear out all the not important stuff, and they're ready for the day. So it's actually very, very beneficial to the work, even though it takes a little time out of their life, their regular life. But people actually like that. But on the other hand, it also creates this huge demand for response. So we can see, it's a joke, but we can see how that can be useful.
Yeah. The last question that I had was for Musa, and this is just geared more towards computational methods in general, because I often find that undergraduate students are very interested in computational methods, but not always quite sure of how to learn more about them or how that might fit in with the research that they want to do. I think on the graduate student side, we also feel the same way. We can conceptualize these studies, but we don't know how to leverage computational methods. So do you have any advice for people wanting to get their feet wet in looking at these new rapidly emerging methodologies?
I always emphasize a healthy level of autodidactism, like just go and try to learn everything through YouTube, through Google. Most of my computational knowledge or like methods, I have a bachelor's in neuroscience, and that's not really that heavy on the computational end. That it talks a lot about cellular and molecular biology and a lot of the basic stuff that you need to know as a biologist or a neuroscientist, but not really that much in computational. So a lot of my training that has really come in computational methods has been just finding an interesting project with Professor Weber and with Frederick, and just figuring it out. And I think the lack of information or like lack of resources now cannot really be argued to be the limiting factor. So it's just, you're going to break things, you're going to get really frustrated. And then you will find that you spend 3 months learning something that is not relevant, but that is how you get an intuitive knowledge about it. Because then you're really a master of it, because you know what works and what doesn't work. So yeah, a lot of good stuff being good channels on YouTube. Everybody starts with scraping. So if anybody is interested in like computational methods, just type in scraping, beautiful soup, selenium. Rewind this in the video section, and you'll find tons of resources. And then just play around with it. And yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We are just about out of time for our Q&A, so I'm going to turn it back to Ron.
Awesome. I'm extremely inspired. This is fascinating stuff. For those attendees who are unfortunately not able to actually participate other than through Q&A, even if you're not interested in the specific details, you know that the topic is important, but also want to convey this is the kind of insights and subtleties and understandings you can develop when you hone a research approach, particularly a communication approach, but others as well, and how many different tools are available to you, but also required. So you can understand things and you can really enjoy understanding things. I think it's really important.